Welcome everybody. Welcome back to those who have joined us before, and I guess it's welcome for the first time for those that are coming up to the series now. The fourth episode of Shtick. It's been a long ride. My name is Alissa Symon, and I am a PhD scholar at the Global Institute. I'm also doing my DPhil at the Department of Sociology in Oxford, and I have been hosting this series. And with us today, I am so happy to host Miriam Borden. So Miriam is a doctoral candidate in Yiddish studies at the University of Toronto. And she also teaches the Yiddish language classes, which she just did before coming online with us. She leads walking tours of Toronto's historic Jewish neighborhood with the Ontario Jewish Archives, serves on the boards of the Ashkenaz Festival and the Canadian Jewish Library Awards, and is also a fellow with the Wexler Oral History Project at the Yiddish Book Center in Amherst, Massachusetts. So it makes a lot of sense to be hosting Miriam today because, as you know, we'll be discussing the series called YidLife Crisis, which is actually an online series for those of you that know the difference between online and television and all the different genres. It premiered in 2014, and the creators, Ellie and Jamie, are actually they're old friends already from, I think, elementary school. And they did not grow up speaking Yiddish. And yet YidLife Crisis only speaks in Yiddish most of the time. And it's interesting, and Miriam will talk about this later, about why they chose to do a sitcom in Yiddish and what they bring into play in this series. And they actually spent more than a year conceptualizing YidLife and thinking about what it's going to be about, what it's going to be talking about. So it depicts two young gentlemen, and their names are Chaimi and Laser, and I think to a large extent they're depicting the creators themselves as they attempt to tackle what they say issues connected to relationships, life, and the Jewish community. So as usual, what we're going to do is we're going to hear a presentation from Miriam. It's going to be about 10 minutes of a presentation, and then we're going to open up to the floor for questions. Those that are watching us through Zoom, you can type your questions in the Q&A portal. Don't do so in the comments. That is very confusing for me. So just put it inside of the Q&A. And those that are watching us on Facebook Live, you can do so on Facebook Live. But before we do that, we're actually going to watch the first episode of YidLife Crisis. It's only 5 minutes, so it's going to be a real treat. And the only thing I need from you is to bear with me while I connect us logistically to watching it. So just give me a minute and we'll be on.
Lass ich nicht glauben, du kannst essen nicht.
Lass ich nicht glauben, du esst nicht.
Scheut, Mann, es ist verkackt in Yom Kippur. Ich bin gekommen von schon, die letzten 30 Minuten.
Ja. Und die hat doch nein gesagt, nicht nur sagen, es ist nicht so kein Gott im Himmel zu sagen, du wirst etwas essen, Yom Kippur.
Ich hab erst gesagt, dass wir können nicht wissen, oder Gott existiert. Zweitens, es ist nicht von Gott, dass ich hab Meuch, es ist die Älteren.
Mein Stein kann er werden.
Auf den Dach man. What?
Mein Heim, alle da.
Mein Stärker, Mann, mach nicht keine Acht, das passiert, weil ich bin Bobemeister von Brande geht der Kuppe. Nimmst du alle mit, was Bescheid vorstellt? Und du wirst schon gewinnt verstehen, warum kann deine gewöhnliche Macht übertieren?
Bist gerecht. Ich nehm das Lactate-Pill, Tomer dein schlechte eigenem Säune, was sehr non zum Säune ist Reul, fachsam mit mein Moral.
L'chaim. The lactate.
Meinst du, das ist der Gelehrte, Je find mir eine Beheime, was trinkt die Milch von einer anderen Beheime.
No, noch einmal mit das.
Wir seien nicht gebeutbar von Lactose. Und für was? Tausende Jahren von Inzest. Ja. Euch gezählt. Ja. Zum Beispiel nehmen die Jiden, Chinesisch und die Scottish, seien als klug, talentiert, übergerecht mit dem Geld, können einhalten, gerne wäre möglich, aber mit einem Lactate geht kacken.
Was sagst du zu der Scheiche zwischen Inzest, Wissenschaft und dir Boris?
Er wurde.
Keith, excuse-moi, vous êtes? Mon ami ici veut commander quelque chose, je pense.
Favos. J'aimerais commander un poutine régulier, s'il vous plaît.
Super.
Mazel tov.
Et la sauce à côté.
Pardon?
La sauce à côté, merci beaucoup.
La sauce de la poutine à côté de la poutine?
C'est ça que j'ai dit.
C'est pas une poutine, ça.
Ce sont les mêmes ingrédients, c'est juste que c'est un peu séparé. Dans le fond, c'est une poutine, ça.
Écoutez, on est à la banquise, hein? Donc,
Oui.
on va vous faire une poutine tout ensemble. C'est correct, ça?
OK. Avez-vous un dictionnaire, peut-être? C'est pas dans le petit Robert, ça.
Ah oui, pas de problème.
Oui,
Ça
c'est
va être
super.
un extra de 50 cents pour la sauce en
Ben,
dessert.
ça ne fait rien, il va payer. OK.
Tabarnak, man.
Was willst du von meinem Leben? Ich darf essen, will essen, aber will jetzt nicht mischen mit der Milch in der Fleisch.
Also ist der Mann ein Poutine-Separatist, du einer.
Das ist ein fleischigen Joich.
Was genau, jetzt sagst du, es gegräht auf den Tisch geschmiert, in Chaserei, Schrimp, Kuh, Hindel, Treff, man, Damm, Spadea, Kini, Marcus Bechoires, aber du darfst erzählen auf die Sauce von einem Patat und Fromage, kennst du sein, mehr Deutsch.
Seinen etliche Sachen, was jeder tut nicht. Verstehst? Merci.
Ja. In een beetje Midlife Spermis.
Nein, kann ich essen.
Du verschämst mir wie ein Montrealer und wie ein Jid.
Lactate?
Verpflanzt Joi Pelz.
Yeah! Yeah!
Mein Stein.
Great. So that was the 5 minutes we had, and now we're going to hear Miriam's comments on YidLife Crisis. Here we go.
Hi. For some reason, I am not seeing my, I see myself, but I'm not sure if you can all see me. Can you see me right now, Lisa?
Yes, we can all see you.
Oh, good. Okay, excellent. Yeah, so that is one of my favorite episodes. It is the very first episode, in fact, of the entire series. So I'm really glad we got to all share it together. I don't know if you could hear or see me, but the entire time I was laughing out loud. There are several moments that just get me every time. I have seen this countless times. I've taught with this episode before, so I'm really glad we got to see it together. So I guess I want to really start by providing kind of an overview of the Yiddish world today, because I think what may surprise many people is Yiddish in this context at all. So as some of you may know, Yiddish is spoken widely by certain parts of the Hasidic world today. It is also kind of experiencing something of a renaissance right now that I think has really developed and really come into its own over the last, let's say, 20 years. So what I'm referring to is the world of secular Yiddish. It's an extraordinarily diverse world. It attracts interest and students from every corner of the globe, and not only Jewish ones. And I think one way of understanding Yiddish is as a language and a culture that on the one hand is 1,000 years old. Another way to understand it is, in addition to being this language that is like deeply rooted in history, it's also a key to one expression of modern secular Judaism. So what I'm referring to is a way of experiencing Jewishness beyond the context of religious observance. That's I'm really simplifying it, but that's, I think, in a nutshell, how I would describe it. Yiddish is one way of accessing a sort of cultural Jewishness, in other words. And the way this cultural Jewishness is represented varies widely. So Yiddish resonates for some on the political left, who see in the history of the language the legacy of progressive politics from the early 20th century. Yiddish resonates for others in Jewish food and culinary tradition. For others, Yiddish resonates musically, and this is related to the celebration of klezmer music that began in the 1970s. And for others, Yiddish provides a kind of insider access to the tradition of American entertainment, especially comedy. There's a long history of Jewish representation in American comedy. This is well known, I think, and it's really gotten to the point now where it's actually become sort of difficult to distinguish between North American humor in general and Jewish or Yiddish humor. This is an interesting point we're at. So the series, YidLife Crisis, as the title indicates, this is a series that deals with the crisis of living as a Jew in the modern world. The series deals with Jewish identity, Jewish tradition, and the concerns and anxieties of Jews living within that tradition. So these are anxieties about marrying other Jews, raising Jewish families, living a Jewish life, keeping kosher, observing the Sabbath, and all of that with the addition of being a modern, secular, and even atheist person living in the modern world. When it comes to the comedy of YidLife Crisis, the comedy is in some ways a given just from the moment they open their mouths. And what I mean is, it is in a way absurd for two young people in 21st century Montreal, which is where their series is set. It is absurd for them to communicate with each other only in Yiddish. Why? Well, after the Second World War, for a variety of reasons that we can go into later, if you want, Yiddish did not remain the daily language of the majority of Jews. This was the condition sort of Yiddish before the war. This was the language that 3/4 of the Jewish world spoke every day. After the war, that wasn't the case. Some Jews who were native speakers of Yiddish continued to live in a Yiddish world through subscribing to newspapers and being members of clubs and things like that, and tried to raise their children in Yiddish. Others abandoned the language altogether. And so the result is that most Jews of Chaimi and Lazar's generation and younger than them don't speak Yiddish today. That is in general, the condition, the situation. So Ellie Battalion and Jamie Ellman, who play Chaimi and Lazar, they're a little bit unique actually, in that they come from the unique landscape of Montreal, which after the war emerged as one of these centers for Yiddish. It became sort of a second center for Yiddish post-war. And as a result, there are still Jewish schools today where children learn Yiddish in addition to Hebrew and French, and of course English. Ellie and Jamie attended one such school. So their relationship to Yiddish is somewhat, I guess, more intimate than that of most other Jews their age. For most people, the only Yiddish they've ever heard or will ever hear comes from their grandparents or their great-grandparents. So there's very much a generational dimension to all of this, which is what makes it so absurd that two young people would be speaking Yiddish together. And Ellie and Jamie play with this idea in the show, but they do it kind of implicitly. So, you know, the characters they play communicate with each other in Yiddish, but not really with anybody else. I think we saw that in the clip we just saw. They communicate with the waitress, for example, in French. With other characters, they speak English, sometimes French, but Yiddish is generally reserved as an insider language for communication just between the two of them. It's a closed system, in other words, and that closed system allows them to speak freely about almost anything, especially things they wouldn't necessarily say to outsiders in English or French or other languages. And by using Yiddish like this, they create this space where Yiddish conversation becomes a forum. It becomes a forum for taboo things like sex and drugs, which they talk about at length in other episodes, but it's also a forum for serious debate about Judaism, God, Jewish tradition, Jewish identity, and a host of kind of attendant philosophical questions. And some of this we just saw in that clip. So one question I think most people wonder is why Yiddish? They're obviously, I mean, they have English available to them, and they have said themselves that it would have been a lot easier to write this in English and perform it in English. So why Yiddish? They have explained that it wouldn't have made sense to do this in any other language. They wanted it to be part of the Yiddish comedy tradition, which in their eyes had to be in Yiddish or not at all. And they also wanted the show to explore the multifaceted and multicultural nature of Jewish experience. And Yiddish, which is this fusion language of Hebrew and German and Aramaic, a little bit of Polish, a little bit of Russian. It's a language spoken by Jews of all kinds all over the world. Yiddish was kind of a metaphor and a medium for this message that they wanted to convey. I want to say also that, you know, YidLife Crisis, they aren't the only Yiddish comedians today. In fact, I think the way most people encounter Yiddish today is actually through comedy. So this is not exactly a rare venue to find Yiddish. You can find Yiddish comedy by exploring archival recordings or watching any film by Mel Brooks or experiencing the ways that Yiddish has become part of just American English. And as I was preparing for this, I was reminded of an event that the Forward newspaper hosted online earlier this summer with 5 Yiddish comedians. And there was this interesting conversation that happened during that event about the nature of Yiddish comedy that I want to think about for a second. So Michael Wex, who is this, if you're not already familiar with him, check him out. He's this amazing Canadian author, playwright, Yiddish comedian. Michael Wex in this conversation was describing Yiddish humor as something that's based on a sense of being out of place, of being disoriented, of not understanding, you know, the rules of your surroundings, of being affronted or confused by the new world around you. So generally, it's a sense of being an outsider and sort of not getting it, not knowing how to react or appropriately respond to what's around you. And what he was wondering was how the new generation of Yiddish comedians will handle that, because these are people who are very much at home in American culture or Israeli culture. They're perfectly adjusted to the cultures, you know, from which they emerge. So, you know, can this kind of Yiddish comedy even survive in the hands of this kind of generation? And what I want to say is that Ellie and Jamie are part of that exact generation. They're part of that new generation of Yiddish comedians. And if you think about it, you know, I think their Yiddish humor actually sits right at that crossroads of being at home and being not at home, you know, of being an insider and being an outsider. And I think that's what makes their comedy so interesting and so poignant. You know, Montreal, Canada, these are very familiar to them, of course. But what they do is in the series, they use Yiddish to distance themselves from that familiarity, to view the world they know through a Yiddish lens. And the result is that it isn't the outside world that is foreign and confusing, but it's they who become foreign and unintelligible to the world around them. So it's sort of a reversal of that situation, like the waitress who can't comprehend why anyone would order poutine with gravy on the side. By the way, I just want to clarify, poutine is kind of Canada's national dish. It's cheesy fries with gravy. And it's delicious, and it comes in vegetarian iterations and kosher ones, I should add. So the episode we just saw, which is already from 6 years ago, is a classic example of the YidLife Crisis approach. It's the holiest day on the Jewish calendar. It's Yom Kippur. And they find themselves in the one place that no Jew should ever find him or herself on Yom Kippur, which is in a restaurant. And it's a non-kosher one at that. It is the worst kind of abomination. And, you know, the thing is, though, they're not there because they don't know any better. They know exactly what they're doing. They're very knowledgeable about the situation they're creating. It isn't that they're not taking Judaism seriously. They do take Judaism seriously. They wrestle with it. They labor over its meaning. And in the end, they order cheesy fries with gravy on the side because, you know, maybe Yom Kippur, but meat and milk together, some things are just like non-negotiable, right? Each episode comes with a warning and a disclaimer, which we saw. The following contains references to adult situations and coarse language in Yiddish. Actually, I'm not sure if we saw that in that clip, but you see that at the beginning of every other clip. There's another clip that says, grandchildren, do not watch with your grandparents. Grandparents, do not watch with your grandchildren. So there's this implicit recognition there of the generational dynamics at play that I mentioned earlier when you're dealing with 21st century Yiddish. and the acknowledgement that what viewers are about to see and hear will transgress the rules of those dynamics in various ways. They're warning you that they're going to discuss things that might make your grandmother uncomfortable or might make you uncomfortable. And where YidLife Crisis likes to sit, where Jaime and Laser are themselves most comfortable, is in that discomfort. And I guess, oddly enough, it isn't their denial of God or critique of religious belief or ritual observance or even smoking pot on Rosh Hashanah, which they do in another episode, or eating poutine on Yom Kippur. None of this has gotten them into trouble. It's actually the greatest source of anguish over YidLife Crisis has ironically come from Yiddishists, by which I mean the community of students and teachers and devotees of the Yiddish language who are committed to the preservation of Yiddish. YidLife Crisis was actually critiqued in their earlier episodes, this one included, for their ungrammatical use of Yiddish or improper word choice. And Jamie and Ellie have said in interviews that they actually felt these critiques entirely missed the point of what they were trying to accomplish. Other responses, though, have been overwhelmingly positive, both from Jews and from non-Jews. People really appreciate the way they dive so deeply into issues surrounding Jewish identity and how one chooses to express that identity and grapple with it. People appreciate the way YidLife Crisis creates this space where different cultures can be represented together and learn from one another, this exchange. And there are people, like myself included, who have a deep respect for the way the series opens new and fascinating discussions, I think, around Yiddish and what it means to be Jewish in the 21st century. And in addition, how these things can work together. So I will leave it there. And
this is, yeah. So first of all, thank you so much, Miriam. That was really interesting. And I think also for a lot of us, maybe just like an opening to a world that we're not really acquainted with. First of all, YidLife Crisis is a bit, it's not like prime time television. So you could say it's a little bit niche. And I think also for many of us, just the acquaintance with current Yiddish culture and also maybe what happened a century ago Yiddish culture, that was really, really good. So for all of us, for all the people watching us, this is your time to start typing in the questions into the Q&A, and we already started receiving some. But before we do that, I'm going to take my opportunity here and kind of start us off. So I think maybe one of the questions that I've been asking myself is which real issues of Judaism do you think the series brings in? So you talked a little bit about, the milk and meat and the pork on Yom Kippur and stuff like that, but I'm wondering, is there any discussion of theology? Is there a recognition that we're doing something that is culturally Jewish, but we're actually non-religious Jews? What exactly do you feel is the dialogue that YidLife Crisis is having with the Jewish religion? And maybe what are the points where it intersects with satire, where it's maybe making fun of the Jewish religion, or it has kind of a self-humor about the situation that they're speaking in Yiddish, but they are very not good Yids. Yeah.
Yeah. There's a great article, an interview with them called, I think it's called Bad Jews Making Good TV or something. You can read a full interview with the two of them about the show and what they're doing, and I recommend it. Because they portray themselves as, for lack of a better word, bad Jews. What does that mean? Jews who are not particularly observant, although the character, you have Jaime and you have Laser. Jaime sort of is the atheist antithesis in some ways to Laser, who's the more traditional kind of, he has a guilty conscience in many ways about not observing, and sometimes the dynamic is that Jaime is trying to kind of to pull Laser out of this kind of what he sees as a sort of a blind willingness to just observe ritual without really understanding it, and that's where it all comes. Those conversations really happen. You saw just now in that clip, right, where Jaime says, you yourself said you didn't care. God doesn't care about eating on Yom Kippur. And he's like, no, that's not what I said. I said there's no proof that God exists, right? So they get into that there. There are other scenes. That's sort of a reference to a conversation that clearly happened off screen that we haven't seen, right? But there are other conversations that happened right there on screen. There's a really great episode, I think, about, I think it's in season, there are 4 seasons, I think, right now. Maybe I'm wrong about that. I believe this one is in season 3, maybe. It's about Sukkot. And Laser has built this incredible sukkah, this like beautiful, comfortable sukkah. And they actually spend the entire episode, I think it's a little bit longer, I think it's about 6.5 minutes. And they spend like the entire episode talking about the holiday. What is the holiday and what does it mean? And is it Jewish Thanksgiving or is it something more? Is it a spiritual Thanksgiving? And they go into it, and it's actually quite a, they, from my perspective, they portray themselves as kind of yeshiva bachers, students in yeshiva, debating these issues at like a fundamental level. Like, what is the meaning of this holiday? Which is one of the fundamental questions that the Talmud always asks. What is the meaning of Hanukkah? What is the meaning of that? That's really what they're doing. They're engaging with those questions so boldly and so clearly. It's a very Jewish show in that way, even if it weren't in Yiddish. And then of course the Yiddish layer that's a whole new dimension, right? So where's the satire? It's a great question. In some ways, I wonder even if satire is the right way to describe the show and what it's doing, because for satire, you really need, there's like an established system. There's a status quo that the satire seems to be upholding and reinforcing, but then it pokes holes in it, sort of subliminally or not, or explicitly sometimes. What's interesting about Yiddish has always been the sort of the sort of underdog, I guess. Yiddish has always sort of been understood and been experienced and lived by people within a larger context that's not happening in Yiddish. So what's interesting about this show is that the context they're living in is a Yiddish context, but then of course they zoom and they make you believe that, you know, at first glance, before you understand that before you hear Chaimi speak to the waitress in Yiddish, you might think that actually they live in a holistically Yiddish world, that everybody in the show is going to speak Yiddish. And then you find out they zoom out and they pull the curtain back and you see, oh wait, actually no, they're in a French speaking world. They're in an Anglo world, but also a French speaking world. And they're the only ones speaking Yiddish. So, you know, in some ways, there's some level, and I wonder about this, and I have wondered about this, that I wonder to what extent their commentary is actually a critique of the fact that Jews no longer really have Yiddish to use in circumstances like that, to use as this sort of closed system of communication where you can say certain things that you wouldn't say in English, right? I'm wondering in some ways whether their insistence on using Yiddish in this way, in such a contemporary kind of way, is somehow a critique of the situation of Jewish language today.
That's a really interesting point that I didn't think about when watching YidLife Crisis. I just want to go back to one of the things that you said about being bold and actually asking the Jewish question, why do we celebrate Hanukkah? Why do we celebrate Sukkot? And I want to connect it to the previous episodes we've had on Shtick. So if you watch the first episode of Shtick, we talked about the Jews are coming, Hayehudim ba'im. And there we talked about, you know, the fact that it got religious people really angry. It's so blasphemous and it's so against God. But then the speaker that we hosted here, Netta, she said, no, but actually this is the religious sermon. And I feel like what is happening again and again when we look at these this content, both the first episode, the second episode, when we talked about Life of Brian, 2 weeks ago when we talked about the Righteous Gemstones, which is about evangelical Christians, time and again, what we've heard from our speakers is this idea that really these shows are having a very deep conversation with religion. They're having a very deep conversation with the theology, and not one that is necessarily blasphemous or is anti-religion, but one that is asking questions, you know, from a modern perspective, from where I'm living, you know, the Gullus, Montreal in Yiddish. What does it mean to have Sukkot for me? What does it mean to have Yom Kippur? And that's the most Jewish question that exists. And it's just really interesting how, for some viewers that are watching YidLife Crisis, or for some viewers that were watching Life of Brian, it's quite upsetting. It's an upsetting piece of like art or work or however you want to refer to it. But for others, it's actually making them closer to their religion. It's actually asking the questions that maybe they don't have access to, that they're frightened to ask out loud. And then the series comes and says, well, here's Yom Kippur. What do we do on Yom Kippur, right? as a non-believing, what do I do? Am I non-believing? Am I believing? And it's just a really nice way to kind of frame that conversation. So just wanted to connect what you just said to our previous episodes. We have
I want to just add, I can just add something.
Yeah.
When I spent a year in seminary in Jerusalem, and I remember I had a teacher, Menachem Liebtag, who said, he taught us a Tanakh class, a Bible class. And I remember he always said, take it seriously, not literally. And that is exactly what I think Jamie Ellman and Ellie Battalion are doing in YidLife Crisis. They're taking it seriously. They're taking Judaism, Jewish observance, Jewish tradition, tropes of Jewish, the idea that the Jews are somehow all lactose intolerant, right? They're taking that really seriously and asking real questions about it that are not unintelligent questions to ask. And I think, so they're taking it seriously, not literally. And that's something that Chaimi accuses Laser of doing. You take all this stuff so literally, they're not taking it literally. And that's where I think the genius really is. And that's why I think they've had success. It's not just a silly show. It's a very smart show, actually.
Yeah. So we have a question here. And as I was asking, for the average Jewish person who is not familiar with history, Yiddish brings connotation of Haredi communities. Is the series in dialogue with that world, the Haredi 21st century world, or is it deliberately not doing that? And also he asks, do we know if there are any Haredi people that watch YidLife Crisis?
That's always the question, isn't it? Yeah, okay, I'll take the first part of the question first. No, I'll take the second part first. The second part is, these are questions, the questions of to what degree the Haredi community engages with Yiddish content online is a question that has dogged researchers for the longest time, since the beginning of the internet, really, because it is just so difficult to know. I have heard recently, this kind of opened my mind, because, and I should actually preface that by saying that in general, use of the internet is discouraged in Haredi communities. And I should say in general, I don't want to say entirely, but yes, in general. And nevertheless, there are ways, there's evidence, there are Yiddish forums online that you can sort of like Yiddish Reddit, for lack of a better comparison. There's essentially Yiddish Reddit that is not, I mean, sure, it's populated by some secular Yiddish speaking Jews, but in general not. Recently, somebody said something that I said really expanded the way I think about this. They said that in New York, especially, to access some of the welfare programs offered by the city of New York, you have to have access to a computer. There's a lot of poverty in some of these communities. So it's interesting kind of, there may be ways that the internet is finding its way, a computer might be finding it into a Haredi home. Maybe that wouldn't be the case a few years ago, and now it is. So it's a difficult question to answer. I cannot answer it. Whether Hasidic Yiddish-speaking Jews are watching YidLife Crisis, I cannot answer it. I'm sure the answer is yes, in some small way. But no, what they're doing is they're not really, they are doing something completely different with Yiddish. And they do reference Haredim. They do reference the fact that, that there are these very Orthodox Jews who live in their own neighborhoods, in fact, who dress completely differently, behave completely differently, eat in different restaurants, date differently, and yet speak the same language. And I think and moreover, are also Jews. And I think, so there's that shared, not only the shared language, but there's the shared sort of cultural fabric that you just cannot escape. And I think even though their position is very much one of secular Jews, they, in very subtle ways, they acknowledge the presence and the complicated relationship in that way, right? The complicated relationship they might have to a Yiddish-speaking Haredi family. So for example, they're having this conversation, what episode is it? There's another episode I was just watching about, it's very Hanukkah appropriate, so I recommend, I think it's called Bastards. I think that's the title of the episode. And the Yiddish word is mamzer. And so they describe sort of Jewishness as something that is a bastardized thing. It is a combination of all these different things in the way, in their, that's how it comes out in their discussion. And they walk out of the restaurant where they're having that conversation, and they walk by a Haredi man walking toward them, and he goes, "Good Shabbos," And he goes, Gachabis. And so there's that kind of brief but meaningful exchange. And there's this total contradiction in a way, the contrast between
this good Shabbos and his good Shabbos.
And they're wearing, and he's wearing his black coat and his hat, right? And they're wearing like shorts and flip-flops and t-shirts. And it's just this amazing contrast. But they bridge that divide. And it's a beautiful moment, actually. It's very subtle. And it's just the last couple seconds of the episode. But so it's moments like that appear in these episodes over and over again.
Amazing. We have a question here from Anna, who actually is asking us over Facebook. So she's asking a little bit about, so we mentioned in the kind of the snippets before today, the politicization of like how Yiddish has become a political language and how Hebrew has become a political language. And you mentioned it a little bit in your presentation, but maybe if you can add a little bit more content as to why today Yiddish would be described as left and Hebrew would be described as right.
Sure. It's complicated. I'll start like that. And I spend a lot of time trying to exist right in the middle and trying to understand how Yiddish can both be something that is understood as left and something that can be understood as what you might call right. And what I mean by that is like deeply traditional. And in fact, depending on how far you take it, Haredi, right? So you kind of have this interesting, how can both these things exist at once? And I think, first of all, I think that duality is fundamental to the nature of what Judaism is, number one. I think being a Jew in the world, you learn to live with contradiction and sit in between those contradictions. I know I was listening to a beautiful interview with Jonathan Sachs, Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, alav shalom, where he describes that he spent most of his career describing that the in-betweenness of what it is to be a Jew in the modern world. And, you know, I think, I want to say that I think it's a misnomer to describe Hebrew as right and Yiddish as left. It is, however, because languages can't be either of those things. Languages are simply tools of communication that people use to whatever ends, right? Languages are objective things. But I think it's the associations, right? It's the applications of those languages in what context. So of course you can characterize Yiddish as something that is diasporic. It is something that is non-territorial. In other words, there's no one place where people spoke Yiddish and everybody who comes from that place speaks Yiddish, the way French has that, or German has that, or Russian has that. No, Yiddish is non-territorial. It travels, it doesn't have borders, and it never did. So it is diasporic, sort of fundamentally at its core. It was always sort of subordinate to Hebrew in some ways. So I mean that literally. Sometimes in older printed Hebrew books, religious books, in fact, you would have the Hebrew text on the top and below that the Yiddish. So literally subordinate to the Hebrew. In other words, and because it was subordinate and Hebrew was sort of elevated as this holy sacred language, Yiddish was the vernacular language, the language of everyday life. And so there's that sort of dichotomy exists. It's just sort of essential to both those languages and the way they function in Jewish life for hundreds of years. So it is secular, in other words, Yiddish is secular, diasporic. It is also modern. We talk about modern Yiddish literature. We talk about Yiddish being modern. We're really talking about the development of Yiddish as a language, as a literature, as a culture that really began at the second half of the 19th century. So we're talking about a period of about, 170 years at this point, of Yiddish being intentionally developed as a modern language, where modern experiences could be conveyed and explored. Before that, Yiddish wasn't thought of in that way. So Hebrew, on the other hand, right, we can say Hebrew is territorially defined. It is something that historically was traced back to Israel and now, of course, exists primarily in Israel. It is considered a religious language in its sacred usages, right? Its ritual applications, the language of the Bible, and so on. And it is ancient. So if Yiddish is secular, modern, and diasporic, Hebrew is all the opposite of those things. And there are interesting ways in which, I think these are objective facts at some level. At another level, I think there are ways that they become sort of, these things start to define the language and define the way they're used. Rather than just being objective facts about the history of the languages, these become oh, well, Yiddish is left and Hebrew is right in that case. They become imbued with politics, the politics of the day. They become, and politics today, I mean, it covers so much. We're not just talking about economic politics, we're talking about social politics, and we're talking about national politics, right? So I think, and Hebrew and Yiddish become sort of part of those conversations in interesting ways that can become really destructive, I think. And that's what I really try to push back against. I try to understand, like I said, how these things can actually work together and how they can support each other and define each other in productive ways rather than destructive ways. But
yeah, I'll touch on that point of destruction. So last year, I led a reading group here in Cambridge with some of the students, and we called it the Yiddishists. And what we did is we read text from the political Yiddishists, the very far of the left movement of the 20th century. And we were reading texts by Victor Medem. So Victor Medem, for those who don't know, he was like one of the people who really theorized Bundism. Okay, he was like the founder of the movement, sort of like the Theodor Herzl of Zionism. So we had Medem. And I was looking for translations for the students, and I couldn't find a single translation into Hebrew. And that is when I started thinking about the fact that these languages have become so political, because there isn't, the Hebrew press, encyclopedias, you name it, have not talked about who this guy is, Medem. Ask any, Israeli, who is Victor Medem? The leader of the Bund movement, which was one of the biggest Jewish movements in Europe in the 20th century. They don't know what it is, and it hasn't been translated into Hebrew. And there's a deliberate reason why these Yiddish texts have not been translated into Hebrew, because it is against Zionism, is against, the whole idea of returning back to Israel, the creation of the modern Hebrew language, right? Like Victor Medem, like they spoke in Yiddish because they were Yiddishists and they were doing political activism that was left-wing. And I think that that's where we find these cleavages between the languages. We find them when today we can't access certain texts in Yiddish because they haven't been translated into Hebrew or English. And there is a deliberate reason, and that's what I was also telling my student, there's a deliberate reason why these texts are so hard to come by, why these, you could go to Yivo, right? YIVO is where all the archives are, and you can sit there and try to break your mind on this Yiddish, all these Yiddish texts. But if you don't have good Yiddish like you do, right? I don't have good Yiddish, so you just don't have access to a huge part of Jewish history. And I think that really it's up to people like you, unfortunately, to kind of bring in this content. And we've maybe diverted a little bit from YidLife Crisis, but I think that the fact that we're seeing episodes like YidLife Crisis and more Yiddish content that is modern, that is hip, that is chic, is also maybe the reclaiming of the diaspora, saying, hey, we have a voice too. Hebrew is great, and that's a good culture, and Zionism and Israel, that's a lovely thing. But there is also diasporic Jewish renewal happening.
Absolutely.
And
Absolutely.
And we're here.
Yeah, and I think, and part of that is very much that it's not so distant from YidLife Crisis, actually, because the idea that Yiddish still has something to offer the Jewish experience of the 21st century, that is fundamental to what YidLife Crisis is about, and what not only what YidLife Crisis is about, but what Yiddish studies today is about. It's about, as you said, recovering documents and music and films that would otherwise be lost to us, but have so much to tell us, and so much they offer us the tools to understand our position in the world today. And without those tools, we would be lost, or we will have lost a huge piece of the story of what it is to be Jewish in the modern period. And I think so absolutely. So you hit it on the head.
Yeah. So we're actually coming to the end of our time. And I just wondered if you want any concluding remarks, and we can just wrap it up. I think a lot of the other questions that came in, we kind of touched on already. So I just want to keep to the times.
Sure. I guess what I would say is Google YidLife Crisis. They are everywhere. They are, especially now with everything virtual, they have been so active in engaging with their audience. And I think they have films. They have a documentary called Judaism. You might have noticed so much of their series sort of happens in restaurants. They're always talking about or over food. Food is always like jumping off point for talking about kashrut, or talking about, there's one episode on Hanukkah about Greek food, and feh, I don't eat that stuff. It's like, what are you talking about? That happened a million years ago. You still mad about that? So it's like, they have a great documentary where they actually focus on food. There's a series also that is in English, but really interesting, called the Global Shtetl, which is a series of films. They did one, or series of short films. They did one actually in London. They go and explore historic Jewish neighborhoods and sort of dig into what was the Jewish past here and what remnants are left today, and what can we learn about them. So they have sort of really expanded since this first season 6 years ago. They've really kind of expanded what they do, developed it even more deeply, and are really exciting and entertaining to watch. So I really just recommend that, stay tuned. I think what they have to say is interesting. It is unique, and the way they're saying it is certainly unique. So,
yeah. Miriam, thank you so much for joining us today. I'll just say, first of all, because this is the last episode of Shtick where we actually learn new content. Next week, we're just going to be kind of giving an overall, maybe the conclusions we have from these series. But I will say that for me, at least, the ability to access these kinds of content that the diaspora is producing is really important, both as a Jewish woman, a Jewish chaplain, and somebody that works on Jewish politics on my PhD. So I think there's something that is happening in the Jewish world in the past decade with relation to Yiddish, with relation to the diaspora, that it's really interesting. And for all those that are watching, I really endorse everything that Miriam said, and watch these things. They're important to understand religion today and to understand Judaism today. So thank you, everybody, for joining us. Have a good afternoon if you're in Montreal, a good morning if you're in Washington, and a good evening in the UK and Israel. Thank you, Miriam. Thanks again.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.